Hello, I'm hematologist oncologist Dr. Tony Talibi, and we're back with Dr. Ann Moorbacher, Associate Professor of Medicine at University of Southern California. Now we're going to discuss the treatment of stage 1 and 2 Hodgkin's lymphoma. Thank you for being here.
My pleasure.
All right, so let's assume a patient has had a biopsy of a lymph node, which has come back positive for Hodgkin's lymphoma, and they've had CAT scans or PET scan, which only shows the disease to be on one side of the diaphragm. What happens next with that patient?
Well, assuming they've completed the rest of their staging, we still do the bone marrow biopsy.
Okay.
We're not entirely certain there's any group that can skip that.
Okay.
We just need to confirm that it is truly stage 1 and 2.
Okay.
We often do use a PET scan these days when we've got a biopsy proving this is Hodgkin's disease, because it is helpful not only in telling us where the disease is, not that CT isn't quite accurate by itself, but it'll be very helpful to us after we initiate treatment in seeing what the quality of response to treatment has been and whether this patient is on a good track for a cure with their frontline therapy. But the next step is to also determine whether the disease is bulky. And there's different definitions of that because there's often a decision to be made about whether there might be a completion of the treatment with radiation therapy to that site of bulkier disease. Historically, or until very recently, we would recommend that every patient who had a lymph node that was more than 10 centimeters or about 4 inches, even if they did a full course of chemotherapy, that they should finish with some radiation therapy to that area. It used to be very extensive radiation, and over the years it's been narrowed down to now being very limited, what we call involved field radiation. And now even that is coming into question. That's been the hot topic in Hodgkin's stage 1 and 2 patients over the last 2 years, whether we can even omit the radiation step based on PET scan restaging early in the game after the initiation of chemotherapy. And that may even depend on what chemotherapy was chosen, although there's not that much variation in that as yet.
So please go over the B symptoms again, and if a patient does have B symptoms, does that change your management in stage 1 or stage 2?
It makes us a little suspicious. There is a group called early unfavorable where they are still, and there's a slight a lack of clarity perhaps to some individuals on what that definition is, but in general, disease that is bulkier, patients who have other risk factors like a more elevated sedimentation rate, higher LDH, B symptoms will tend to connote that there's a little more to that disease than maybe meets the eye. It's not one size fits all with stage 1 and 2. So bulkier disease, B symptoms, elevated SED rate might make us think a little further about whether they should not shorten their cycles of chemotherapy or use any of the abbreviated regimens. And that's a specific group that the large European groups have studied with some attention to that detail.
I see. So if someone has lost weight or they're having night sweats, that is more concerning.
It's only one of many factors. So sometimes people say, well, you know, I've looked up the bad risk factors for Hodgkin's and I've got this one. One factor never matters entirely by itself, perhaps more than, say, being stage 4 versus stage 1 or 2. But they all add up, and that's why some folks will refer to these risk scores, such as the Hasenclever score, whatever, that we actually have on the web, for example, to add up whether someone's got a few negative risk features. That's more for stage 3 and 4 patients, though. So 1 or 2 individual negative factors are not necessarily going to change therapy or even change the overall prognosis that much. But we do take them into account a little bit with someone who has no B symptoms, no bulk. They might be able to do a slightly shorter course of chemotherapy, finishing with very small field radiation, versus a patient who might be better off finishing the full course, whether or not they are thinking of having radiation because of bulk sites of lymph nodes and so on.
I see. So what chemotherapy would you recommend?
Currently in the Western world, and for perhaps longer than the past decade, the standard of care has been ABVD, a 4-drug regimen, given intravenously once every 2 weeks for a total of 6 months. So it's actually 12 doses. They call them cycle 1A, 1B, 2A, and 2B. And the drugs themselves are considered very moderate in terms of their medical side effects. It doesn't always feel that way to the patient. The side effects are a little bit annoying with that regimen for some individuals. But it has had a very, very excellent track record of cure, even in stage 3 and 4 patients. So we're very reluctant to move away from that. The German study groups, Hodgkin study groups, have developed a much more intensive regimen called escalated BIACOP, and that has shown modest advantage over ABVD in poorer risk patients, but it's at a price. It has a 2% risk of causing acute leukemia. It causes a very high rate of infertility in males in particular, and is a harsher regimen. So we generally are reserving that only for the very highest risk stage 3 or 4 patients, not these patients in stage 1 or 2. So the question with ABVD is more how many cycles and whether to finish with radiation or not. The standard full course is 6 months or 12 doses of this if a patient is not pursuing radiation, and then there's been a number of studies looking at shorter courses completed with radiation. The more unfavorable factors in there, the more likely we are to insist that someone try to finish the whole 6-month course.
So the A stands for adriamycin. What side effects should the patient expect with that?
Adriamycin is a sort of classic chemotherapy drug that's used in many diseases, including breast cancer, so patients will hear about it if they've had a friend or mother or sister who's had breast cancer. That's a classic one for making them lose their hair, although it's given in sort of a half-dose format in ABVD, so the hair loss is more gradual rather than abrupt like it is with the other regimens for most individuals. People with very thick hair might actually not really lose it till much later in the course of therapy. The concern we have for particularly our older patients or patients with other heart risk factors is cumulative doses of that drug can slightly affect the pump function of the heart. Not generally thought to be a big issue in young adults, but it is an issue for children with growing hearts or the older patients with that. Generally, we'll check a pump function of the heart by echocardiogram or MUGA scan before we start, just to make sure that they're starting with good function, that we don't need to be too concerned about that. It is given in this small dose fashion that is not very risky, but certainly has to be considered if someone already has decreased pump function of the heart before they start. Causes sometimes a little discoloration in the nails. It can contribute to the nausea and certainly adds to low blood counts that you see with each cycle of chemotherapy in a sort of cyclical pattern as you take the cycles of chemotherapy.
Well, the B stands for bleomycin. What are the side effects of bleomycin?
Bleomycin has some very distinctive side effects. It's an old drug, but a good one. They try to take it out of regimens and the cure rates don't seem as good. So the thing that it's well known for is having a potential for causing some inflammatory irritation of the lungs. So Lance Armstrong isn't very big on bleomycin, but it's been a core part of the Hodgkin's regimens for a very long time, even before ABVD was invented. It also causes sometimes acute symptoms of fever or chills. It's often given with a test dose on the first day, just to see that someone doesn't react too strongly to it. And if they have those symptoms of fever or chills, they're often given Tylenol or ibuprofen or even a little steroid pre-medication in the mix to try to tone that down. They don't necessarily feel ill with that fever, but sometimes it's sort of dramatic, 103, and they're having little shaking chills, and it's sort of strange, but it doesn't necessarily make them feel that bad.
I see.
It happens on the first night. Whereas we have to distinguish that from fevers someone has maybe in the second week after the chemotherapy. If they have a fever during that time, it might actually be an infection, and they should call in to their medical team to make sure they get checked out to see if their white counts are low or if they need to come in and get antibiotics.
I see. So you always tell your patients if they've had bleomycin and they have fever that night not to worry about it, yes?
That very first night, if we knew their white counts were good when they started their chemo, which we usually do, we know that that one's usually just related to the bleomycin. It often happens while they're still in the chemo room, so we already know about it in many cases.
What about the V? What does the V stand for?
The V is Velvan or Vinblastin, and that is also another old drug, way back when, developed from plant alkaloids. And that drug causes constipation. Is probably the most noticeable side effect to patients. Not necessarily a problem, but for some of them it is. I've occasionally had someone who had to be hospitalized for that, so it's very uncommon, but we ask people who have problems with constipation to try to make sure they're cleared before they come in for their chemo cycle, because if it runs slow for 2 or 3 days, they might find that uncomfortable. Occasionally causes tingling in the fingertips and so on. That is a reversible event that usually goes away with time, but that's known for that class of drugs.
What about the D, the dacarbazine? What are the side effects?
That's the strangest of the old drugs. It's not used in many other diseases anymore. But it is a little bit notorious for contributing to the nausea aspect of the regimen. And all of the drugs together contribute to causing low blood counts, predominantly of the white blood cells, in the sort of 10-day period after the chemotherapy, somewhere between day 8, 12, and sometimes even right out to the day that the next cycle is due. The white counts may run low, and if they run very low, below a certain number, we call the ANC, or absolute neutrophil count. In the past, we used to hold patients' chemotherapy or give them growth factors, booster shots, to bring their white cells up. More recently, we found that those growth factors might enhance the irritation factor of the bleomycin for the lungs, and so we're a little more reluctant to use it. And they're finding that it is fairly safe to just keep going on schedule, even if the white counts are running a little below that ANC that we like of 500, that most people don't actually run into infectious problems with that. They sometimes ask me, what can I do to prevent infections? And that's where the diet issue comes in. Paradoxically, we ask them maybe to keep what we call a neutropenic diet during that period if they are running low, to avoid salads or strawberries or things that grow on the ground that are hard to wash thoroughly. Whether that really makes a difference has not really been clear. But we ask them, and we don't want them to like lock themselves in a room, but to be careful about hand washing and not being around other people who are sick. Most of the time they're just going to, be at risk for catching colds or whatever their kids bring home, and that doesn't necessarily cause any bad outcome with their chemo or their disease, but sometimes if they're sick, they're going to want to delay their chemo a few days, and they get sort of thrown off schedule, and they'd prefer to just avoid that.
I see. What do you recommend to both your male and female patients in terms of fertility preservation?
That's generally fairly positive news in the current era because we use ABVD, which does not appear to inhibit fertility very significantly at all. But it's a little confusing. One is that if we have to choose that escalated Biakov regimen, that's one of the decision-making points. If someone hasn't had children, if it's a male, we can ask him to sperm bank, and that's very successful, and they're very likely to be able to have children through that methodology. For females, it's very difficult to preserve eggs. Generally, you have to already have a partner. They have to be fertilized. You have to take hormone-stimulating agents to harvest those eggs. That would lead to a long delay in initiating therapy. And the technologies are not that perfect. They're not that successful. And getting insurance coverage of them and all is sort of a huge headache and sometimes very prohibitive. The good news is generally we don't feel that ABVD has much impact on fertility. Therefore, a woman who's currently fertile or having regular periods is not necessarily going to have to put a lot of concern in that area. They do slow down and sometimes stop having their periods, though, but that's more from a direct effect of the chemotherapy inhibiting the growth of the uterine lining. My bigger warning to folks on ABVD is that they not get pregnant. I've had that happen, and they're maybe being a little distracted by their chemo or their work, and they shouldn't rely on their periods being there or not to indicate anything either way about their ability to get pregnant. And we also have to caution males. We don't think the chemo agents would really probably cause much damage to the sperm or create any genetic problems for offspring, but it's probably not a good idea theoretically to get pregnant. So we ask them to use birth control during this time.
So aside from not getting pregnant, do you dissuade patients from having sexual relations with their partner?
No. In theory, I guess if their white counts are low, they might want to be a little more careful or use a condom, but we don't know if there being any real reason that they shouldn't be able to have sexual relations during that time. They're often a little tired, but sometimes from a support point of view, they want to feel closer and more intimate to their partner, and they're generally welcome to do so.
I see. What about actually a risk of leukemia itself from the chemotherapy? What is the story behind that?
Well, as with the risk to fertility, that is more of an issue with the alkylator agents, as we call them, some of the drugs that are in Biakov. The rate of infertility in males on that regimen, the escalated Biakov at least, is almost nearly 100%. It's about 97%. And the risk if someone undergoes an autologous stem cell transplant is very close to that as well, because these very strong alkylator drugs tend to knock down the function of the ovaries and the sperm-producing cells. On the other hand, not much of an issue with ABVD.
I see. What about the risk of leukemias and anthracyclines specifically?
So I'm sorry, I distracted from the question. The leukemias are related to that same risk. Those alkylator drugs are DNA damaging agents. That's partly how they kill the cancer cells. So there's about a 2% risk of acute leukemias or myelodysplastic syndrome, sort of abnormal bone marrow growth. that occurs with alkylator drugs, including Cytoxan used in other diseases, and the ones that are similar to it in, say, Biacop or the transplant regimens. There is a potential for that with the adriamycin and ABVD, but it seems to be very rare. And for most intents and purposes, we don't consider it a significant risk of ABVD. It's been too small a risk to particularly pick up in the larger studies. But it certainly has been reported in higher dose anthracycline regimens in other diseases. There's been a few cases. There are occasional cases, and they have a distinctive genetic change that tells us that it's probably from that class of drugs.
What about the risk of secondary cancers in people who've had radiation to their chest area?
That's been a very important issue in Hodgkin's, and one of the big debates why we're looking at so carefully at the risk factors for needing whether we need radiation therapy anymore in the regimens, and what kind of radiation we can give. Can we limit the field? Because that was a tremendous risk historically in Hodgkin's patients. The first curative therapies for Hodgkin's disease were actually based on radiation alone, and only over the years of developing new chemotherapy regimens such as ABVD did that start to replace the primary radiation therapy. So years ago it was a very large field called a mantle field of radiation, and there was a huge risk of breast cancer, lung cancer, sarcomas, thyroid cancer, and in addition to the cancer risks to the heart.
Exactly.
Now that we've learned that many of the non-bulky cases would not benefit further from radiation, and other groups that had used radiation as an adjunct, such as the Stanford 5 protocol, that really didn't enhance the overall outcome. We're starting to take radiation out of most of the regimens, and we're even questioning in the bulky cases whether we can use the criteria of PET scans early in treatment after 2 cycles, typically 2 months. The full cycles have been looked at in European trials, particularly in German trials and other groups, that suggest if that PET scan's gone completely negative, that is an excellent predictor that the patient will continue to do well. On their regimens, based mostly on the Biacop regimens, it appears that they can omit radiation even to the bulky stage patients. It's not completely proven with ABVD that is true, but there's certainly a lot of interest in leaving radiation out. So approximately, in the past, 70% of Hodgkin's patients, even in the recent past, would get radiation to consolidate their chemo regimen, and now that's dropping to about 20%, at least in some of the larger trials, because they're being more selective about who may need it.
I see. So let's say someone has had radiation, especially a woman. How often should they get mammograms, and when?
That's a difficult question. There seems to be an age-related aspect to that risk. So very young women who are, say, 18 to 22 at the time they had their radiation are probably at the highest risk, or 18 to 25, because the breast tissue is still growing and maybe at more risk for DNA damage. Once they reach 30 in some series or 40 in other series, that risk seems to level out. And by age 40, at least in American staging systems, we would ask that they start to have annual mammograms anyway. But the question is, someone who has breast radiation or mediastinal radiation at age 18 or 20, should they start their mammograms earlier? And are they that informative? They're younger women, they're harder to examine by mammograms, they might need to look at them by MRI, and so on. And there really hasn't been a clearly established guideline. We just suggest earlier.
Earlier, I see. Okay.
And that has to be interactive with other breast cancer risk factors, if there's breast cancer risk factors in the family.
I see. What do you tell your patients regarding the odds of cure and the chances of this cancer coming back? They're stage 1 or 2.
Generally, the outcomes are excellent, but excellence all in the eye of the beholder. To a cancer doctor, since Hodgkin's disease has an excellent prognosis compared to other cancers, we think everything looks great. To a young person who can't even imagine they would ever get cancer, 90% doesn't sound great.
Right.
And so generally in a stage 1 or 2 patient who doesn't have the unfavorable risk features, we can tell them, their chance of being cured even from their frontline therapy is probably better than 90%. Start to add in a few of those unfavorable factors. Say it's a little less than that, but there are many patients who are going to be able to recapture that either by going to high-dose chemotherapy and stem cell transplant if it comes back, or making sure they do the extended full course of chemotherapy and so on. Some patients don't want to hear the numbers in great detail, and so we sort of try to gauge that in that first discussion. I usually think that people need to hear it once, but we can continue to emphasize the positive news after you've heard the numbers. Maybe the cold facts briefly. We move on to why we think that's good and that we have a backup plan, even if they were to relapse after that. Because in general, it is a very positive situation. It's only a very occasional patient who's going to die of Hodgkin's disease. Most of them are going to be successfully treated with that first line of chemotherapy. And of the few that relapse, they'll have an excellent chance of success with the second line, which is usually going to incorporate high-dose chemotherapy and a stem cell transplant.
I see. Thank you so much. I have learned a lot myself. Thank you for watching. We hope this has been educational for you.